So if we can start perhaps with how you'd characterize the AIOps market right now. I mean, it's been around, is it since about 2017? So how do you see it's developed since then?
I was sort of thinking about this. Let me sort of caricature it in one way, in the sense that it feels a little like the sort of angry teenager. Yeah, it's in those sort of angst years of the teens where they've got a lot of great ideas, they're making a lot of noise, but they're now just running up against the adult world. And so by that, I mean, it's sort of running into the realities of running, hybrid IT environments, and therefore, getting itself a little lost in the mix, I think, in terms of what's going on. So, there's a lot of noise around AI ops, but it's not getting the sort of adoption you would expect. And there's an element of, people thinking, do I need to go do something different? You can see the AI ops companies all thinking, where do I focus? How do I do this? So it does feel like those sort of rather angst-ridden teen years where you think you've got a great idea and can't see why the rest of the world doesn't accept it. But the reality of trying to deal with, large enterprises with very complex hybrid infrastructure, lots of legacy around, I think it's just sort of slowed it down. And, and there are challenges around, people understanding what AI ops actually is, what problem is it solving? And they haven't, the industry generally tends to jump on bandwagons when they see it fairly rapidly, and it takes a long while for the terminology, the taxonomy to get, to make itself understood. And I think AI ops is in that sort of problem at the moment. What is it actually trying to do? You've got vendors who are born AI ops native, if you could call them that, trying to sort out, and we can come back to what do we mean by that. But all the other areas of IT ops management are all starting to add AI ops to their stories. And so the question becomes, okay, so what is AI ops? And I think that's roughly where it is today. It's a lot of promise, a lot of youthful exuberance, but actually starting to run into the challenges of a much more complex arena than perhaps they thought it was going to be. I just wonder whether the AI ops people thought cloud was going to take over rather faster than it actually did, because it's very, the original AI ops was very cloud focused.
I mean, it sounds from what you're saying, you would say so far then it's, whether to say underperformed or it maybe hasn't met expectations up to this point?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I think that might be a little unfair to say it hasn't met expectations. I think, one of the challenges is, and you say 2017, 2016, whenever, it's not a long period of time. We expect things to take off fairly rapidly. The reality is that AI ops doesn't appear to be genuinely disruptive. It's an additional capability rather than a complete industry disruptor. And therefore, you're not likely to see the sudden explosion of sort of growth of AI ops, simply because it's actually about improving operations rather than disrupting any business models. And I think that's been the challenge for it. It's now got to fight its way into, in amongst all the other tools that are trying to make life easier for operations, rather than being something where business people are going, jeepers, I can get a real advantage by doing this. I don't think it's, and maybe that's one of the challenges. Maybe they've never made themselves attractive to business. And that's maybe a story that, they need to think about for the future.
So do you think, I mean, as companies, most companies seem to be embarking on digital transformation is what everyone's talking about, and the pandemic may or may not have accelerated that journey. So do you think as companies look at that digital transformation process, AIOps is, as you say, it's not, wow, this will do it, but they will arrive at it at some stage and think, yeah, this is a nice, add-on tool, or this will help with that journey?
Certainly the latter. I suppose it's the term digital transformation that I'm, struggling with here. Actually, what digital transformation always feels a little bit like a sort of general cop-out. It's sort of, plus it feels like a bit of a one-off project. And of course, what we're seeing is a world of perpetual change. I mean, at Bloor, we call this being mutable, a mutable business, because digital transformation feels a bit like a one-off. You think, actually, this is how you thrive and survive in a continually changing environment. No, I think for me, the thing that's going to bring it all together is this complex multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, infrastructure piece that says actually the only way we can get to grips with all this and the data, I mean, particularly the amount of data and the amount of analysis that's needed and the speed with which business changes. So if you bring together sort of velocity of business and changing business models, the impact of losing your IT now is much greater than perhaps it was some years ago, and people are beginning to realize that. So it's not digital transformation per se. I think it's this coming together of all the complex multi-cloud arena, running bang slap into, the 70 or 80% of enterprise businesses still runs on legacy infrastructure. And saying, how do I make sense of all that? And how do I make sense of all the data that's being thrown at me when the business expects me to turn on a sixpence? And you then get back to, well, automation is probably the only way you're going to do it. And therefore, to drive automation, you need a level of AI. And that's sort of, you're coming at it sort of, you're reversing into a realization that, oh dear, right, okay, now I get it. I really do need AI ops. So yes, I suppose you could say digital transformation, but I just, it's a personal beef. That's the wrong way to look at it. It's the complexity and speed of what's happening to IT operations that means AI ops will become an essential tool.
And in terms of, I think you alluded to it earlier, but is it definitely an add-on tool to all the other myriad monitoring, measuring tools that people might have, or is there a possibility that it might actually replace some of these and rationalize that sort of complex environment?
It's a $64,000 question. And I mean, in the short term, you're not going to replace all the other tools that are out there. So the question that many of the AI ops companies have been grappling with is, how far do I try and create a single integrated solution? And how far do I go down the route of providing, just acting as a sort of data ingestion coordination type tool? And this is dreadful. You'd love to be able to say it's one or the other. I've sort of veered between both. Go back 2 years, I was thinking maybe you could get a single platform that did the whole thing. Certainly at a level, you're always going to need a level of deep dive in APM or network performance management that a generalized tool with a single interface isn't going to provide you. But I was sort of coming back to, for practical reasons, the thought that actually, yes, you can reduce the number of tools, but you're still going to have quite a large set of tools. And it's how you collect the data, because it's the collection of the data is becoming commoditized. We're looking at things like Open Telemetry Project now, where you could get quite a commoditized collection of data environment. And therefore, what do you do with that? And the value is in how do you analyze and do something with the data. So I think the reason I'm sort of hesitating is that two things. Firstly is back to that multi-cloud arena. Then I think some of the major players in the market, whether it's the IBMs or the VMwares or whatever, are looking at multi-cloud as a way of reinvigorating their approach to the market and starting to see the possibility of acting as the sort of central controlling function, because they've got such a legacy infrastructure that they understand and are aware of, and are actually coming up with some quite good tools around the whole modern infrastructure management piece. So I think that there's that element. And then you get some new players coming in who are aggressively trying to go for the market. And here I would say, and I'm not saying whether they're good, bad, or indifferent, but if you look at Splunk, they are growing from what was basically a data analysis, data collection, data analysis, AI piece, into something much broader. And they're very aggressively going after multiple sectors of the infrastructure operations management market with their tool sets. And they're quite open about saying, I'm not saying anything they haven't said in open conversation. They're aggressively going for And they've clearly got the momentum that maybe will take them there. Now, questions around the legacy side, how do they deal with that? But come back to open telemetry, maybe they think that will help them get over some of those issues. So the answer is, it needs to reduce the number of tools that are in use. Will it replace all of them? In the short term, I can't see it.
Okay, and mention of IBM, VMware, and Splunk brings us maybe on to the vendors, and clearly they're all coming at it, as you've alluded there. And there's pure play sort of AIOps companies, people coming from the network monitoring, infrastructure, even the application side. So, do you have any sort of handle on what may be the best approach? And again, I suppose for the end user, there's a myriad of, they just look at it and think, well, I'm being bombarded. How do I move forward with this?
Yeah, difficult one. I think one of the attractions of pure play AI ops is that it doesn't attempt to, if you like, remove as many of the tools, because it relies on the monitoring and existing infrastructure tools to provide it with the data it needs to do its analysis. So to an extent, if you've got a fairly complex environment with lots of different tools, AI ops is actually not a bad way of trying to pull it all together into one sort of piece. You can still argue that actually IT operations departments need to be looking more collaboratively across the piece and getting rid of those tool sets. But certainly there is an element of, using AI ops in that sort of environment. And of course, AI ops in a cloud only environment, it might be, is a very good tool itself. So the challenge, I suppose you're asking me is, are there vendors who are, capable of, if you like, looking at that sort of, and giving that different approach. And my real challenge here, and this is, I think, the challenge for all the vendors, is they need to make themselves relevant to the business. At the moment, they're trying to make themselves relevant to IT operations. Therefore, the business is not seeing the value, and therefore, IT departments trying to justify big new expenditure while they're still battling individual teams who've got their own preferred tools, are going to find it really difficult to get this one to adapt. So I think one of the challenges is getting AI ops, if I can caricature the whole space, and I think it's sort of IT operations management generally, to really connect with the business. This is not about how well my cloud is performing. It's not how well is my disk subsystem running. It's not how good is my application, what's my application response times. It's about real business. If my credit card transaction-based system crashes, am I going to, if I'm MasterCard and it crashes, am I going to lose everybody to Visa because they don't trust my ability to deliver the services to the customer? So it's really much more about saying, why is it so important to have this understanding of what's going on? And so this is back to, what should people be doing? They should really be trying to get somebody in the business who becomes their sponsor. I think there's a need for IT departments and IT operations people to be saying, who in business, maybe at a board level, becomes the sponsor? It's a bit like automation generally. How do I get people to understand that this is a business issue that they need to bring on board? And I don't see much of that. A lot of the stories that you see about, whether it's reducing the amount of noise for IT service management, reducing the number of false positives. It's all very much around the performance of IT operations and IT service management, rather than what's that doing for the business. It's what's it doing for the operations department. And I think that's where it needs to move to. Interestingly, from my perspective, one of the areas where this may start to become, give a slightly different perspective is if you look at the whole process of cloud migration. We talked about digital transformation. Well, one of the things that's going on is everybody thinking, what do I run in the cloud? What can I or can't I run in the cloud? And how do I do that? And actually what the AI ops tools should be giving you, and I think this is where one or two are starting to go, is how do I use that learning capability that's there and that data ingestion capability that's there to look at how I can model and then prove which applications I can take to the cloud and how they're going to perform in the cloud. Because obviously, everybody's got this sort of, right, how much can we get to the cloud and how fast? And oh God, is it going to cost me a lot of money to do that? I think AI has got one hell of a opportunity to say to business, we can make this a much less risky approach than currently. At the moment, there's an awful lot of services as opposed to service that has to be added in the cloud migration process, which can take time and is a bit hit and miss. And I think the combination of the ability to model and then learn from what's going on and play back would be something that would be very, very interesting in the cloud migration process, which might get you nearer to the business element of what applications you're putting into the cloud. So it's maybe a slightly different take on where AI ops might want to go.
But so it may the part of that problem you've alluded to is that a lot of it's sort of bottom up, dare I say. So people, the network people, they've got a bit of traction in the company and they're trying to add AIOps. But the successful approach is more, if you can get to the board and say, here's AIOps, this is what it can do for your business. But the problem is, as I say, they've all got contacts in the networking department or the application, and they're trying to sort of upsell and meeting a bit of a barrier. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. They're meeting internal barriers, and the business doesn't really know that it's a challenge, quite how much of a challenge it is, which is where the cloud migration is probably a little nearer to their hearts because it's costing them money. You're getting quite a lot of anecdotal evidence of migrations that have not delivered the cost benefit in terms of computing they were thinking of. But yes, absolutely. Anything to do with automation, I think, needs much greater sponsorship and top-down approach in terms of getting a strategy around that identifies how important this is to the future. I mean, AI ops as a term itself, I always think is difficult because the other issue is people don't necessarily understand or trust AI, and therefore AI ops. So what are you going to tell me? You're handing over the operations department to AI. You can just see the sort of the Google autonomous car versus the sort of VW Park Assist story going on ahead. Would I really do that now? And why would I do that? So there's an element there of trust building, but it's got to be in conjunction with what's the business imperative. And there are real business imperatives. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, we were looking at a number of vendors there who could actually handle, either an ad serving or financial trading environment where it's not a case of whether you lose the system or not, it's whether it's still performing, millisecond performance. If not, I lose millions of pounds, and there were tools out there that did that were starting to use AI capabilities to predict when there was going to be performance problems. And obviously that's a fairly niche. It's a high value in one sense, but there's a small number of potential customers. And a lot of other people didn't see the need for that, and so a lot of other vendors were, well, that's not my market, that's not what I'm doing. And it became quite fractured. But I think the sort of whole move to the cloud and the multi-cloud could bring things back together. But again, only if business understands that from the top down.
And in terms of the vendor landscape and maybe the different approaches of trying to get AIOps raise the profile, I mean, clearly I don't want you to feel under pressure to say these guys are great and these aren't, but what companies, if any, do you think are interesting in the way they're doing approaching this AIOps puzzle, if you like?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at the sort of pure play AI ops, the ones who really don't try and get into the sort of collection of, the monitoring side of that, or the legacy sort of infrastructure management side of it. The people like Moogsoft and Big Panda, in pure AI ops terms, are interesting. I think Splunk are interesting simply because their ability in the analytics side. But good, bad, or indifferent, I'll leave that. The challenge, the one that's really intriguing for me, will be whether they call them the big three in this market, would be IBM, BMC, and VMware. I would have put CA, Broadcom, in there some time ago, but I think they've, dropped away a little bit in terms of acceptance and what's going on. I think, the challenge of integrating all the pieces maybe. But so I think there's an interesting split coming, because you've got a whole bunch of companies. I know we've talked about this in the past, coming from different areas: network performance, application performance, old server management, all those sort of areas, all coalescing in the middle. And there's a whole range of companies that range from sort of $25 to $50 million turnover type companies, who are all fighting in the same spot. And to a greater or lesser extent, they're all doing very similar things with a slightly different orientation. It's a network orientation, or it's a DevOps orientation, or it's you name it. There's a sort of a slew of those. And so you sort of get the feeling, is there a leader going to come out of the pack anywhere? And they're all struggling to make the jump from 50 million to a billion. They're coming to that chasm phase. And yet you've got other companies who are much bigger, but haven't quite focused on it, who might just get their act together. You put the sort of IBMs and VMwares and BMCs in that market, and then you get the newcomer like Splunk. It's actually very large, very aggressive, very focused, that might just do that. But there are, we've talked about these companies in the past. When I was talking about the high performance stuff, you look at Vertana, which was the old Virtual Instruments, or you look at ITRS, which is a UK-based company, that have got significant expertise in that sort of space, but of moving to develop the AI capabilities, sometimes through acquisition, sometimes through development, and we've seen quite a lot of that. Is there a company that I see really jumping out and dominating the market? Not at the moment. I think the market's still in too much of a flux. And my sense is that AI ops ultimately will become a cog in a much larger business services automation, environment. It's got to find its spot within the whole automation piece that's going on at the moment. And so, is there going to be a huge AI ops market? No, I think there'll be a huge business services automation market in which AI ops sits.
Okay, well, funny enough, that was what I was going to move on to. If you could characterize, AI ops within that bigger automation piece, and maybe as a supplementary, there are loads of ops. You mentioned DevOps, there's SecOps, there's NetOps, you name it, ops. I guess, how does it fit? So, A, in the automation landscape, and B, with all these other, ops flavors.
Yeah, in the automation landscape, it is just another part of it, and actually what we are seeing is some sort of level of focus on, a strategy for automation for business, into which this will sit. And there are certainly one or two companies in this space, one or two vendors in this space, who are taking that more seriously, as where does this sit within an overall automation story. So I think that's, if you take a result, quite often they are the ones that have been more closely aligned to the remediation at the far end. It's really interesting. You look at Resolve, or you look at ServiceNow, from an IT service management point of view, there's sort of a sense there that they see this more broadly as an end-to-end business automation issue that's being addressed at the moment. So again, I still see, to an extent, AI ops, how good's your knowledge of films? It's a bit like the Terminator Skynet, isn't it? It's sort of, that all-seeing eye in the sky. it ought to be a very pivotal part of a digital twin environment, for example. I mean, God, I'm opening up a completely new can of worms there with digital twins, obviously, but this whole way in which software, the whole environment can be defined as software is leading to this sort of the thought that you can model a whole business in software. And if you're going to do that, where's that controlling eye? And maybe that should be AI ops. That's jumping a little further ahead. I mean, that is, some way out yet. But again, in terms of positioning themselves, it is that controlling point. It is the sort of, to go back to an old term, it's the manager of managers, isn't it? It's a term that's fallen out of favor because it was seen as being a little old-fashioned. But the reality is, you are trying to pull all the threads together, which is what AI ops. I actually, went into print with a piece of what we call the spotlight. Looking at, with the real AI ops, please stand up, because it's that piece around, what do you do with all that data you ingest, and how do you correlate all the events that are going on, and then what do you do with that correlation? That's what the heart of AI ops is. So in the automation field, you feel it ought to be the engine room of automation, or the control center of automation. Maybe not the engine room. It's the control center of automation. And in terms of the DevOps, SecOps, DevSecOps, it's please, really, it's again a sense of what we're trying to get to, and this is where you get rid of all the silos, and that's all those terms are trying to do, is to try and make people get rid of the silos. So part of the challenge of automation is to get people, to work collaboratively across those silos. Because my God, automation, I mean, automation was one of those classics, a bit like fourth generation languages 20 or 30 years ago. Yes, everything happens faster, but if the process is siloed and it'll happen, you'll get bad outcomes faster. It's that sort of environment. So, you just can't, you could think, no, what term you're going to give. DevSecOps is bad enough, but if you've got to add something else to it, it's crazy. It's just would you please collaborate, guys? Because if you don't, it ain't going to work. Is the sort of shift left, call it that, whatever you will. One of the things I do see with AI ops is a greater awareness of the need to shift to the application development arena. So as part of a DevOps tool, if I could use those terms. So there's an element of some of that capability needing to shift left, because there's no point fixing a problem if you designed it wrong in the first place. So again, maybe there's a sort of shift left element there. Just shows how complex this all is. It is an end-to-end process. So yeah, I don't know whether I've muddied the waters or cleared it.
No, I mean, that's good. And maybe just a slight tangent, but I mean, collaboration, I know, that's been talked about. I remember 20 years ago, first in the storage industry, people are talking about the fact that the storage guys never talk to the networking guys. And I'm like, why wouldn't you? But anyway, it's immensely, seems to me frustrating that, this fairly obvious thing isn't happening much more. Do you think there's a tipping point at which it will become normal, or we still got too many of these silos that are just so protective that they're not going to give up their sort of intellectual property and job security to let it happen?
Well, it's human nature, so I think you're always going to struggle with that. And I think the challenge is to see this as a cultural and ethos issue, not a technical issue. That's partly back to us saying that you need to get this buy-in from the top, and you need to get this understanding around, where are you going, what are you trying to do, and how do we do that best? The fact that, this is why I think the sort of, whether you call it the move to digital transformation, or the general sort of nature of business at the moment, where everything is about the, IT is the business to an extent, means that the impact of getting it wrong is much, much greater. You know, your business goes down the tubes, not just a little bit of a problem. And therefore, business leaders are going to have to crack the whip. That's probably the wrong term. You know, you don't, you know, but there's got to be an understanding that, you know, you need to work across silos together, because if not, it won't work. You know, it simply won't work. It's a cultural thing, and therefore, I think there needs to be a focus. And IT's not been particularly good on this, because IT people generally are the techies. You know, they like interacting with their machines. They don't, not particularly good at interacting with other people. And there'll be techies all over the world, you know, screaming at me now, going, "That's not fair." But the reality is they've been quite inward looking, you know, and actually you've got to see this as a cultural issue as well. And I think it's, you know, and it's not about throwing more training at people. It's actually about looking at, you know, what skills and capabilities do we need in our IT workforce. You know, one of the challenges for automation is, how do we upskill and give, you know, IT people a more interesting role than maybe just, you know, running around chasing after the fact that my server's fallen over. Now, how do we upskill and do that and give them the confidence as well as the skills to be able to engage in that sort of debate? And that's something that needs to happen, you know, in parallel, but it needs that senior management, that board level focus, because again, training, skill, you know, at the moment, everybody's pinching skills from anywhere else, aren't they? They're not thinking about upskilling and cross-skilling. They're having to, because there's such a shortage. But it's as much about confidence and culture and ethos as it is around technical competency and capability. And I think firms have got to get to grips with that, you know, and we know it's a fast-moving world out there, but unless you get to grips with that and spend some time and effort thinking about that, you'll waste an awful lot of your investment in technology.
Okay, we covered a fair amount ago. I mean, are there any other AIOps specific sort of angles, or, you know, one or two final thoughts as to where, I know it's a bit of a cliche to say, well, you see AIOps in, you know, 12, 18 months, but you know, being optimistic or pessimistic, what do you see its role moving forward?
I am fairly optimistic about where it will end up. You know, whether it's called AIOps at the end of the day, but this thing that we've got at the moment, this ability to ingest huge amounts of data, to correlate events, to start to use it predictively. What I'd like to see over the next 18 months is far more of that predictive capability being used in terms of remediation and automation of simple fixes. You know, that's where it's got to go for it to really add value, to really say, oh my goodness me, yeah, that really, at the moment, you know, you've got an awful lot of data and saying, well, I think you ought to do this. It's got to go beyond that to, and I will fix this for you, and I will take that problem away from you. You know, that's effectively where it's got to go, which is why I think, you know, some of the organizations, you know, we haven't mentioned the likes of a Park Place Technologies that's, you know, moved from third-party maintenance into this space quite rapidly recently. You know, as a sort of interesting, that's where it's got to go, because you know, you're looking at a situation where, quite simply, the business wants IT to deliver, and you know, you can have all the predictions you like, but if you don't then remediate the problems, if you don't, you know, if you can spot the future and then not do anything about it, you are going to fall out of favor very quickly. If you can spot the future and actually fix it before it becomes an issue, then I think business will go, well, that's worth having. That's worth having. So I think that's where it needs to go.
And it sounds as if, as well, companies need to identify, or there needs to be a champion, appointed champion to own it and drive it, as opposed to letting it sort of evolve from one corner of the business.
I think so. I think it will get stuck in the mud, as it were, unless there's a real champion of that inside the business. So I think, you know, one of the suggestions, quite apart from the usual sort of truisms of start small and find something to work on, is you know, find your business champion.
Okay, well, I really appreciate your time today, Paul. Thanks very much indeed.
Well, enjoyed it. And hope the rest of the conference goes well for you.
Thanks again.